The world is rapidly dividing into two camps. One camp is those countries that actually have surplus fossil fuels. There are fossil fuel exporters, countries like the Middle East. And now, interestingly enough, the US as well. And the US is the biggest driver now of this fossil fuel future. Dependence on fossil fuels is actually very scary because, as you said, we already are importing $150 billion worth of fossil fuels every year.
India is not as energy hungry in certain forms of fossil fuel consumption as China was, or the West was. It's also because of cooling versus heating and other such factors.
Yeah. I think also because China became a manufacturing country much earlier and much more intensely than India has become. As we all know, India's manufacturing as a part of our GDP is still less than 20%. In the case of China, it's much higher. And in some ways, China became the workshop to the world. So their power consumption actually went up. But the US shot it down, unfortunately.
The US is shooting down everything to do with renewables these days, right? It's almost like they're almost treating it like as evil to be using solar power, wind power.
That's right. And you know why they're doing it? Purely for economic reasons. Because they feel that if people start shifting to clean energy, it's going to diminish the demand for their fossil fuel industry.
We are relatively self-sufficient. We've got lots of cheap renewable energy that is flowing. We're not worried about Iran wars or Russian sanctions or anything else there. We are good.
So Vikram, in the last 5 years, of the total capacity added in India in the power sector, 80 to 85% was renewables. So therefore, saying that by 2035 it will all be renewables is not a big stretch actually.
Hey everyone, this is the India story. And one of the key things about the India story that we've been talking about for 40, 50 years is energy. The problem around how does India have an energy-rich future? As you move up the value chain, as your economy grows, you need energy. Where's that energy going to come from? Coal, yes, possible, but it's polluting. Oil, well, we've been doing a lot of that, but then we know what the risks with that are, don't we? The $140 billion imports that we pay, and then Iran war suddenly happens and you're worrying about energy security. You're buying Russian oil and suddenly tariffs come in, so you're worrying about energy security. So yes, energy is a major, major issue for the India story, as it is for the story of most other countries. Which is why I was actually quite delighted to read a report a couple of months back by Ember, which says that, hang on, India's fossil fuel dependence may not be as much as you think. As India grows, it may well be an electrotech nation. It may well have a different path to the path taken by the West and even by China. And I now have with me one of the people who co-wrote that report and is also, of course, doing a lot directly in shaping India's energy future and security. Sumant Sinha, it's a pleasure to have you with us. He's the chairman and the CEO of Renew, the second largest player now, I believe, in renewables in India. What, 20 gigawatts is capacity when I last heard, Sumant. So I'm going to talk to you about what you're doing directly. But I'm going to start by asking you about the electrotech part, which you wrote about in the Ember report.
Yeah, sure, Vikram. Thank you, first of all, for having me on your podcast. It's a pleasure to talk about these very important topics that you covered in the podcast. As far as energy is concerned, and of course, energy is critical to any country's future, as it is to India's as well. The origin of that report basically was that we'd done some research that showed that at an equivalent level of per capita income, India was using more electricity, so that was number one, and that we were using more clean energy in our electricity than any other country that had come before in the same development sort of path. And that was actually quite a revealing, sort of statistic that we hit upon. And that showed really that India is making great progress on essentially moving forward towards a clean energy future in its own development evolution more than any other country has done before. So we're doing something very, very different, very, very unique, and something that I think a lot of other developing countries that are behind us should be emulating in the future.
So I'm going to go through this in detail because obviously the implication of that is really, really good because it means you won't be dependent on $200, $300 billion of oil imports. You won't be destroying the environment by having, thousands of coal plants coming up. The climate debate was always countries like India says, we've got to develop. We will need electricity. We will need ACs. We will need data. We will need plants. We need the development. People used to say, yeah, but then if you do that with lots and lots of coal and fossil fuel usage, you're going to destroy the planet. You're saying that doesn't necessarily have to follow.
Yeah, and I must actually give a lot of credit to this government because until 2014, India's position on climate change had been that, look, we did not cause the problem, and therefore don't look to us for solutions. And therefore, if all of you guys, as you developed your own countries, followed a fossil fuel intensive path of economic growth, then why do you expect us to do anything else? We will follow the exact same path. But I think in 2014, when Prime Minister Modi came in, I think he had a very different vision about the future. Where did that come from? I don't know, but certainly it was something that started off at that time. India's position in climate conversations changed, and we said, look, we didn't cause the problem. Yes, that's correct. But we're going to be equal sufferers, if not more sufferers, than anybody else is going to be. And therefore, we need to do what we can do from our side to chart a different path. So that was one, I think, big change that happened. The second big change that happened was that there was a recognition, I think, at that time, that clean energy was actually going to be cheaper economically than fossil fuels. And that was really proven in the next 3 to 4 years as the cost of generating power from renewable energy came down below the cost of coal, and in most countries is the cheapest form of new energy right now. So that change has actually happened, and that now is driving forward this move towards more and more clean energy in our system. But you know what? We are right at the beginning stages of this transition. And there's a long road that we need to cover over the next 50 to 70 years. And the reason for that is, Vikram, think about it this way, that modern economy started off almost a couple of 100 years ago, right? They've almost entirely been based on fossil fuels. Now, our popular culture is based around consumption of oil through driving massive cars, for example, driving big motorcycles that make lots of noise, flying planes that are based on, again, consumption of fossil fuels. So the point is that our entire culture, our entire economies are based on the bedrock of fossil fuels over the last 200 years. Now, as we seek to change that, it's not just a question of putting on more solar farms or putting on more wind assets. What we need to do is we need to change entire industries on the downstream side where the actual consumption happens. And that is going to take time.
So I'm going to try and unpack 3 or 4 things there. There's for an electrotech future, as you described it, there's how are you producing energy? That's one part of it. Number 2, how are you consuming energy? If you're driving an electric car, it's different to driving an internal combustion car. So let's park the consumption side for a minute. When it comes to how you're producing energy, so the position as you're outlining, which is roughly correct, is, look, we need energy. We're not going to suddenly say dark and say we're not going to develop.
Right.
But there's a climate change and an altruistic reason to say we will do green energy. Now you're saying there's an economic reason. It is cheaper to do that. And the third, presumably, would be self-sufficiency, because there's enough solar power here. The sun shines in India more than it does in any other country. If you're buying oil, you'll always be importing it. You'll always be at somebody else's whims and fancies.
Yeah, so what's actually happening now is that the world is rapidly dividing into 2 camps. Okay, one camp is those countries that actually have surplus fossil fuels. There are fossil fuel exporters, countries like the Middle East, and now, interestingly enough, the US as well. And the US is the biggest driver now of this fossil fuel future, which was not the case till the current administration came in, but that is now their considered view. And so you have this camp of fossil fuel countries that really want to do nothing but drive more and more fossil fuels into the world as a whole. And then there are the other countries that don't have fossil fuels, countries like India, which are dependent on importing all these fossil fuels.
China also.
China as well, most of Europe also, and many other developing countries. Now, for us, that dependence on fossil fuels is actually very scary because, as you know, we already are, as you said, we already are importing $150 billion worth of fossil fuels every year. It has always perennially been the Achilles heel of India's economy. And especially in times like this, when there's geopolitical unrest, oil prices go through the roof and India's rupee falls, and all of those bad things happen to us. So I think the fact that we can now, there's an alternative for us where we can actually start relying on electricity as a bigger driver of the energy basket. I think that is something that we must pursue and push forward on. Now, the interesting thing is that this whole thing of moving the clean energy transition started off on the back of climate change. Because obviously we were not heading in the right direction, and we're still not heading in the right direction as far as climate change is concerned. And so started in Europe, pushed forward through the manufacturing prowess of China, brought the prices down, and that really got the whole world to start moving towards clean energy. Some countries faster, some countries slower. And in the previous Biden administration, for example, there was this massive bill that was giving a ton of money into renewable energy, which of course this administration has now removed. But every country was heading in some way or the other towards more and more clean energy. Now, what's happened is that with this divide that has now happened, some countries have fallen by the wayside. Other countries, however, are still continuing down that path. And so, what started off as something being driven by climate change, in India's case, is now being driven by affordability. It is being driven by national security, and all the things that the Prime Minister likes to talk about, which is Atmanirbharta, Viksit Bharat, Make in India, all of those actually play squarely into India transitioning faster and faster into clean energy. So we started as a climate change push, and I think now that critical mass has been reached for the clean energy transition to start happening because of a lot of other reasons as well.
So obviously economics would be the most important one, right? It's one thing to say, oh, you should be using solar and you should be using wind. When China was at our level of development, it's there in the Ember report, when China was at our level of development, fossil fuels were still 10 times cheaper than clean energy was, which means you would use fossil fuels. When India is at this level of development, you argue that it is actually much, much cheaper to be having solar. And it perhaps has been the case for a few years now.
That is right. That is absolutely right. And because solar is now so cheap, and also wind in certain cases, therefore it makes eminent sense for us to do more and more wind and solar and derive more and more of our electricity from that. Now, should I give you some numbers that...
I mean, just share the economics for us. If somebody's looking at this and saying, why is it that a big solar plant would be cheaper? How does it work out? Solar plant versus coal, or getting in a natural gas-fired plant.
Yeah.
What are the economics of it?
Sure. So I'll talk about the economics, and then I'll tell you a little bit about the longer-term future as driven by government sort of thought process around some of these areas. So first of all, in purely generation terms of electricity, the cost of generating 1 unit from solar is about 2.5 rupees per unit today.
Okay.
The cost of generating 1 unit of wind is about 4 rupees, 3.5 to 4 rupees. The cost of generating 1 unit from coal is about 5 to 6 rupees. So solar and wind are both substantially cheaper than coal-based power. But coal has one big advantage in that you can turn it on and off. So it's dispatchable, whereas solar and wind are not. So solar, produces when the sun shines and does not produce when the sun does not shine, and it does not produce anything at night. But consumption is there at night, right? So you have to look at not just the generation cost, you also have to look at the cost of providing round-the-clock power solutions through renewable energy, using batteries and pumped hydro and those kinds of things.
Which means you've got to store, when it's actually generating in the day, you've got to store some of it so you can use it at night.
That's right, exactly. And you have to combine wind and solar together along with some level of storage to be able to meet, let's say, the evening peak and have some power that you can supply at night as well. The cost of that, when you put all of that together, is about, let's say, 4.5 to 5 rupees. So it's still very competitive with coal.
Let me just get that number again. So you're saying the cost of generating it is, let's say, 2.5 of renewable. You add the storage cost, which means the batteries and the other stuff to store it. You're now at roughly parity with coal.
That's right.
Would that be?
Just a little bit cheaper, I would say, but certainly at the very least at parity with coal. So I think that's the big sort of change that has happened, that now you can have almost dispatchable renewable energy at almost similar costs as coal. But coal still has certain other advantages as well, which solar does not have, which is why you'd always need to have a certain amount of coal-based power in the grid, at least for the foreseeable future, until the grid is able to crack the problem of dealing with entirely renewable energy. And that may be some years down the road. I think it'll happen, but it'll take some period of time. In any case, it's going to take us much more time to get to much higher levels of renewable energy. Keep in mind that today, in our electricity consumption, renewables accounts for only 15%. And when I add hydro and nuclear, that number goes up to maybe 30 to 35%. So we're still very far away from getting to 70, 80, 90% that we need to eventually get to. So it'll take us 20, 30 years to get there.
I just want to deconstruct what you just said, because, of course, there were a lot of headlines made last year saying that renewables is actually now more than 50% of installed capacity. But
Yeah.
in actual production and actual consumption, it's a much lower number. Why is there that mismatch?
That is because solar only generates when the sun is shining. So the capacity is, let's say, 1 megawatt, but it generates only for one third of the time, whereas coal can generate for 90% of the time. So the generation from 1 megawatt of solar is about a third the generation of 1 megawatt of coal. So while in capacity terms, 1 megawatt and 1 megawatt is equal, the generation from 1 megawatt of solar is a third that of coal.
So what are the statistics right now then? So if installed capacity is roughly the same, generation you're saying is still much lower when it
Generation
comes
is
to
much lower. As I said, if you add hydro and nuclear, which tend to operate at higher levels, then all non-fossil fuel capacity, which is what the government likes to measure, is more than half now of the total power generation system. In generation terms, it's about 35%. That number is going to go up substantially over the next 5 to 10 years. So let me give you some more statistics, if that's okay with you. So today, keep in mind that electricity and energy are two different things. We tend to use them interchangeably, but electricity is a subset, a subcomponent of energy as a whole. Electricity today accounts for about 20 odd percent of all energy consumption in the country. Of that electricity, renewables is wind and solar, including hydro and nuclear, let's say, is about 35%. So 35% of 20% is only about 6 or 7% of India's entire energy today is coming from, let's say, non-fossil fuel sources. Only 6 or 7%. Now, Niti Aayog has just put out a report that has created certain scenarios of how India can look to get to net zero by 2070, which is a commitment that India has given under the COP climate accords. Uh, to get to net zero by 2070, three things need to happen. First of all, energy itself is going to grow at about 4% a year in India, which is among the largest of any countries in the near term. So at 4% a year, obviously, so that is sort of the base level. Then within energy, electricity is going to grow from 20% right now to about 60% in the next 40, 50 years. So it's only going to get to 60. 40% is still going to be non-electricity. And that also has to be met from certain other areas. And we'll talk about that in a second. But then, and within electricity, renewables is meant to get to 90% by 2070. So when you do the math on all of this, you realize that renewable energy, which is today, when I say renewable, I mean wind and solar now, which is 150 gigawatts of installed capacity today, has to get to, by 2050, on the path to 2070 net zero, to 3,000 gigawatts, which is a 20x growth.
30 years, 40 years later, we'll have to see what is going to pan out. Frankly, these days with AGI coming, I'm not even looking more than 10 years or 15 years in the future. So let's come back to the here and now.
Sure.
Let's come back to this slide, which I'm going to put up on the screen, which is what you were actually showing as part of the Ember report. This is what the West did. This is what China did. This is what India is doing at the same level, the fossil fuel intensity. Again, is this happening because of the economics changing, or is it happening because the technology is much better, which is enabling cheap fossil fuel? Or is it that India is doing something else magical?
I think there are 2-3 things that are at play here. One is a strong policy push on the part of the government, and therefore a very strong desire that we should really grow renewables a lot more than we have right now. And there's this target of 500 gigawatts of non-fossil fuel capacity, out of which wind and solar is about 420 gigawatts by 2030, which is a significant increase from the 150 that we are at right now. So it's a 3x in 5 years. So that is number one. The second thing is obviously the fact that wind and solar technologies have evolved substantially, along with storage, that is now allowing us to have a higher penetration of renewables in the grid, which was not the case, let's say, 20 years ago when China was going through its own growth paradigm. And so because that opportunity is available, India really is capitalizing on that and demonstrating that we can grow now in a different way.
Now, there are obviously going to be issues with everything that we are talking about. I mean, number one, you spoke about the problem of storage. Is that something that can be solved? Like all the renewable production that is happening now, the new capacity that's coming up, is it coming up with attached storage? For example, the amount that you would generate, not all of it is linked to storage systems or BESS systems. So at what point do we start building that storage?
I think we are starting to build it now. And the reason it's happening, Vikram, is because battery prices have come down dramatically. In the last 18 months, they've come down to a third of what they were. They were costing about $300 per kilowatt hour. Now they're costing approximately $100 a kilowatt hour or less. So costs have really come down dramatically. And that is allowing a much higher degree of storage to get installed along with wind and solar capacity. So in our case, for example, we have till now set up about 100 megawatt hours, I think about 200 megawatt hours of batteries so far. In the next year, we'll be setting up almost about 4,000 megawatt hours. So there's a pretty significant change that is happening now. And I think everybody is now setting up much more batteries because a lot of the requirements from the discoms that are coming through are now really with storage. Nobody wants to just buy plain vanilla wind or plain vanilla solar any longer. Everybody wants to buy generation plus storage so that they can move it into the evening peak or they can get this round-the-clock power solutions and so on done.
Okay, so just pure generation is not enough. You have to have generation and storage, which is a major thing. The other thing I guess would be also to strengthen the grid and to have grid-based storage, which is a little better. I was actually fairly shocked to read that last year in India, 2025, we generated more solar electricity than the grid could absorb. We actually wasted something like 2.3 terawatt hours, if I remember that correctly, which is what a million people's energy used for a year, was just in a sense wasted because the grid couldn't absorb it.
Yeah, so this is a real, I think the grid is one of the most fundamental things that needs to be developed in conjunction with all the generation capacity. Because if the grid does not develop, the ability for us to move electricity around from where it's generated to where it has to be consumed, that just does not exist. So grid, and there are two parts to it. One is the physical build out of the grid, which is that you just need to have more transmission lines going to different places. And it's not just going to different places, but at the back end, also connecting all the load centers much better. And the second is managing the grid itself, because you now have a lot of intermittent power from renewables coming in. Keep in mind that we also have the PM Kusum scheme going on, which is solarizing all solar pumps. We also have the rooftop scheme going on, where people are going to, not just generate, but start consuming and trading with each other if this digital stack sort of comes into place on the energy side, which Nandan Nilekani is working on. So the grid management is going to become a lot more complicated than it is earlier. So there's going to be a tremendous, we're going from a system where you had X number of large thermal plants, which were sending power into these large consumption centers. Now you'll have multiple thousands of people making power, multiple thousands of wind and solar generating areas, and obviously a lot of consumption centers, which the demand there is also going to become variable because people are going to be consuming their own power from their rooftop. So you have to forecast when are they going to consume, when are they going to push power in the system. So grid management
upgrading the grid is going to be
very, very critical.
I'm going to start getting action points as to what India needs to do to accelerate this. That's the whole purpose of this podcast. So fixing the grid, making sure that the grid can handle this very complex situation that you're now talking about, would that be one of the top priorities?
That is absolutely the number one priority, because without that, all this generation capacity will start getting curtailed, as we've started seeing last year. And that, while obviously all that power could have been used to give power to a million homes, at the same time for developers like us, you put the investment and then you can't sell the power. It's a net loss to us as well. So I think to protect investments, to give people more confidence that this it is not going to happen, we need a system that is able to ensure that grid capacities are built out fast and that grid management is at the level that it needs to be at.
There could be another possibility, and I'm sure companies like yours are already working on it, which is to say, okay, let's instead build captively for select high energy sources. So it almost becomes like a captive power plant. Data center, there's so much talk about AI and how much data is AI going to, these data centers coming up, where will the electricity or the energy come from that? It potentially becomes possible to have, then you're not dependent on the grid, you're directly supplying to a captive producer, which I think you're also doing. You sell a lot to Google and Amazon.
That is true. But the issue is that we ultimately, you can be off-grid or you can be on-grid. If you are right next to the consumption area and you have good wind or solar capacity or resource there, and you have land that is relatively cheap, then you can do that. But that's very, very rare. Mostly what happens is we put the solar farm, let's say in Rajasthan, we supply to, let's say, a data center in Andhra Pradesh or in Bihar or wherever it might be, and we use the grid to get the power there. So we do tend to use the grid, even if it's us supplying power directly to a commercial and industrial customer. It still has to go through the grid in most cases. Now, in the future, it may be that we're able to set up nuclear plants next to data centers and so on. But again, we'll need to have a situation where the land, the contiguous land, is appropriate for a data center, and right next to it, it is appropriate for, let's say, a nuclear plant. And then also the question of redundancy comes in. What happens if something happens to the nuclear plant? What happens to the data center in that case? So you have to look at all of those kinds of things as well to see whether you can co-locate some of these things or not.
So just that's an interesting sort of digression, but I'm curious. I'm wondering which parts of India would be good both for solar or for wind and for having the water and the cooling and the other stuff that is required for a data center.
So, most data center providers want their data centers to be close to urban centers so that they can access them easily and so on. And that's where the consumption is also. And they don't, data center operators don't like high latency. So if you're very far away from a consumption center, then your latency levels are going to be high, and that is not acceptable to them. So data centers, by definition, therefore, in general, need to be closer to consumption centers or big urban centers. And that's where land is expensive, and that's where you can't put up wind or solar farms. So there is a natural tension there that you have to go far away for the wind or solar capacity and then use the grid to get to the data center.
Right. Is there also a lot of transcontinental thinking that is happening that because you're generating solar power in the day out here, maybe you could be powering, the data center usage for America when it's in the day there? Is that sort of transcontinental thinking also happening? I know there was talk about, for example, cables running from the Middle East to here, which are actually running solar power via electricity cables.
Yeah. So, the interesting thing is, what do you actually move on these cables? If you want to move power, there is a certain limitation to how much power you can move, because you need massive cables, they're very expensive to lay, and so on, right? Theoretically, it's possible. The cost actually goes up. So let's say you put up theoretically a big solar plant in Saudi Arabia. It's 2 hours behind us, and then you lay a big cable into, let's say, Mumbai, and suddenly the Mumbai evening peak is met by daylight power generation out of solar plants in Saudi Arabia. You can do that, but it's expensive. The easier thing to do in the case of data centers is to actually export compute capacity and not export power. So we can actually increase compute capacity in India and sell that to the US. And thereby, in a way, indirectly you're exporting power. So that's an easier thing to do than it is to export the power itself.
So this brings, let's just shift the focus a little bit to consumption, because that's another important part of this entire exercise. One of the reasons you're saying India has an electrotech future and is requiring less fossil fuel. I'm keeping on coming back to that theme because that's the crux of the entire exercise. Are we, as a nation, as we are developing, are we always going to be subject to the whims and fancies of what's happening in Iranian oil markets or what's happening in the Persian Gulf or elsewhere? Are we always going to be hostage to that, or could we be relatively free from fossil fuel? You do refer in the Ember report to the different consumption pattern. India is not as energy hungry in certain forms of fossil fuel consumption as China was, or the West was. It's also because of cooling versus heating and other such factors.
Yeah, I think also because China became a manufacturing country much earlier and much more intensely than India has become. As we all know, India's manufacturing as a part of our GDP is still less than 20%. In the case of China, it's much higher. And in some ways, China became the workshop to the world. So their power consumption actually went up. So that is why to meet a lot of that, they obviously went down the path of coal in the beginning, and obviously oil and gas as well. Now they're rapidly shifting their economy, but it is just that they've become so large that to get any shift happening is going to take them a lot more time. India is a smaller economy, I guess nimbler in a sense, because we don't have the locked-in fossil fuel capacities. So we can move actually a little bit faster than China could.
Till now, it is often said that India will not require. India can have more electricity as the energy basket rather than petrochemicals or fossil fuel, because more of a service economy than pure manufacturing. Then there's talk about we need cooling, and air conditioning can be entirely done from electricity. If you're heating, you might need to use oil. Yeah. So those could also be factors.
Absolutely. So, for example, if you look at different use cases now, electricity, as I said, is one of the use cases, right? Transportation, broadly speaking, as we all know, is a big second use case. Most of that today is coming through oil and gas, or oil really mostly. that whole thing can be moved to electricity, but it's going to take time because all the cars, the internal combustion engine cars, have to be replaced and moved to electric. Today, electric vehicles account for maybe 10 or 15% of India's total sales of all cars. So that number has to go to 100%, and then slowly you have to phase out all the old cars that are there. That will take 30, 40 years, I would imagine, at least.
Why would it take that long? If the same technological changes that you are saying do start to kick in and the same battery prices come down, electric cars become cheaper, is that not something to aim for? That you actually
of course it
phase it
is.
down? Cities like Delhi say that we really want you to electrify very fast so you can breathe.
No, absolutely. So look, I think that absolutely needs to happen, which is why in Delhi you actually see more electric cars than most other large cities in the world. But the issue is that you need to change very deep consumer behavior patterns. There is still this concern around long distance driving, for example. Are there sufficient charging stations available or not? So you need to have all of that getting built out. So I think all of that will happen, but I think it will take maybe about 10 to 15 years for all the sales to become electric, and then another 10 to 15 years to phase out all the old internal combustion engine cars that will already be on the road by that time. So that's why I said 30 to 40 years. It could be faster, but I suspect it will take that long. Now that's just one of the user industries. Then you have industrial usage where you make cement. Cement, if you think about it, is nothing but rocks that you heat to a point where it just melts, right? And then it becomes cement or concrete. So it's almost like that. So it requires huge amounts of heating. The same thing with making steel, because again, you're taking the ore and really, really heating it to separate out the steel from the rest of the material that is there. So some of these industries require huge amounts of heat. Now, heat is very hard to get from electricity, but we are obviously going to have to develop use cases that allow us to replace the heating with electricity as well. So whether it's thermal, solar, or whatever other solutions we need to find out. Then there is, in refineries, for example, we use hydrogen, which is today made out of natural gas, which all can be replaced by green hydrogen made entirely from electricity. So there's a technical solution possible there. Today it's more expensive. That's why the uptake is happening more slowly. But again, the government is pushing that to happen because they realize that it'll bring down our dependence on imported gas. The same thing in fertilizers as well. And there also we need to move it much faster. Again, there's a cost issue. Costs are coming down. And as they come down, you can start replacing in those two industries as well. So there are lots of other industrial use cases where we need to replace.
So if you look at India's entire energy basket, I mean, let's just come back again briefly to the big picture before we start looking at how do you accelerate the change in this area. If you were to look at it, you'll say, well, okay, there are certain things that we will be fossil fuel dependent for a while. I don't think anybody is really targeting that by 2030, India is not consuming any fossil fuels. It's unlikely to happen. Right. You'll need it for planes, if nothing else, and other such stuff. Are there low-hanging fruit that are faster to move, and then you start moving to the more and more difficult things?
Yeah, so look, I think technical solutions are available now in almost every industry. Not all yet, but almost all. For example, in aviation, you have sustainable aviation fuel that you can make from green hydrogen as a starting point. You can also make it from biomass, for example, which is also considered to be renewable. So the technical solution is there. It's more expensive. So no airline would want to start using sustainable aviation fuel unless everybody starts doing it at the same time. So the disadvantage is similar for everybody. The same is applicable in the case of shipping. Now, in the case of shipping, the world as a whole, the International Maritime Organization, was last year about to mandate that all ships should at least have 5% sustainable fuel or green fuels within them. But the US shot it down, unfortunately.
The US is shooting down everything to do with renewables these days, right? It's almost like they're almost treating it like as an evil to be using solar power, wind power.
That's right. And you know why they're doing it? Purely for economic reasons. Because they feel that if people start shifting to clean energy, it's going to diminish the demand for their fossil fuel industry. And so it's really, as I would say, fundamental
selfish.
As that. Yeah.
I mean,
I don't want to use that word, but yes.
Obviously, the economic incentives are different for different places. Now, when you hear the government now talking about this entire transition, when it comes to the sources of renewable energy, I know you're looking at solar very aggressively. There's wind, which is again a fairly substantial part of your portfolio. And then there's nuclear, and then there are hydro is probably, there's only X amount that you can actually do. Is solar the real big thing to bet on, or bits of each of them?
I think eventually solar is going to be it. I think the others will play some role.
So you're an Elon Musk type thinker who said the
I-
same thing. He said at the end
Did
of
he
the day,
say that?
everything
Okay.
comes from the sun.
Yeah, so ultimately, I think solar is going to get so much cheaper. See, I'll tell you what the big issue is. Between the petro states and the electrotech states, the big difference is that the fossil fuel countries are basically pulling out stuff from the ground. And that cost is going to keep increasing. Whereas for us, the big thing that we have going in our favor is technology. Technology continues to move. And just like battery costs came down by, to 1/3 of where they were 18 months ago, solar costs will keep coming down. Now we're talking about perovskite cells, which will bring down the cost by 30-40% of where they are right now, which means you can add a lot more batteries into the system, which means that the cost of delivered power for solar plus batteries is going to be even cheaper in the future. There'll be technological changes that allow you to put solar laminates on your windows, on your buildings, and that will allow you to generate power as well. So the use cases for solar, I think, over the future are just going to increase exponentially.
So that's a major competitive advantage. That's why I was so intrigued by your Ember report, because that's a positive headwind for the Indian economy, or tailwind for the Indian economy, right? Constantly. If you're an electrotech state, which you're saying we should aim to be, as technology improves, costs keep on following, you're not dependent on imported duties, the cost of energy becomes cheaper and cheaper, you're riding it.
Absolutely. So what India needs to do is the following. First of all, electrify as much as possible, right? As many user industries as we can electrify, right? And the second thing is you have to decarbonize the electrification, and by using more and more clean energy sources. So those are the two twin themes of what we have to do. Now, the third leg to that is that for whatever you can't electrify, you actually have green fuels that are showing up, which are also made by electricity in some ways. So that's indirect electrification. But then you can use the green fuels as well for a variety of applications, as I was talking about.
That would be
earlier.
green hydrogen and
Green
other
hydrogen, green ammonia, green methanol, those kinds of things. So there is that huge sort of evolution there that can happen as well. Now, the big thing for India to think about also is that as we do all of this, and it allows us to bring costs down of the economy, because a lot of this stuff is cheaper than using fossil fuels. It allows us to produce all of this electricity and energy within our borders, which enhances our energy security. It also therefore decreases our import bill, which also therefore enhances national security as well. So there are lots and lots of positive benefits of doing this. And I think the government has solidly realized that. And that is why they're pushing forward with green fuels and electrification and the decarbonization of the electricity system, regardless of now really climate change issues, which was the original driver.
So there's economic and there's Atmanirbharta reasons to do this, and that import bill reason to do it. So the reasons to do this are clear. But talking about self-sufficiency, the first thing that people will look at you and say is, hang on, this is all very well that you're wanting to build independence and autonomy by doing this. At the present moment, you're still importing a lot of that solar value chain from China. You're still importing the polysilicon, you're still importing the wafers, the ingots, the solar cells. You're importing them all from China. So you're still dependent on another country and not a particularly friendly country.
No, look, that's a great point. And I think that if you look at the policy stance of the government, I think they don't want that dependence, because then you're replacing a dependence on, let's say, the Middle East for oil to China for importing clean tech, right? And then you really can't call yourself an electrotech country if you're just importing all the equipment. So that is absolutely not.
And especially because you can rely on China less than you can rely on the Middle East or Russia or wherever else you're getting oil from.
Yeah. I mean, oil, all said and done, is a global commodity. There are multiple people who make it. It's globally traded. There are price levels that are very transparent. Whereas on the clean tech side, everything is made in China. There is no other supplier anywhere in the world other than China. So that is not a healthy dependence. Now, what the government is doing is essentially they are slowly preventing imports of equipment from China. And they're giving us as an industry enough notice that this is what they're going to do. with the eventual goal to decrease dependence on imports. And so now what's happening is that there is a whole manufacturing industry in solar panels that is getting set up in India. In solar modules, we already have more than self-sufficiency. We actually have overcapacity now. In solar cells, which go into making solar modules, we will in the next year have reasonably good self-sufficiency. And then we're going to go further back into wafers and then polysilicon.
Can I just ask you to explain that for people watching this for the first time? That entire value chain is what? Modules is the final thing, which, as you said, we have self-sufficiency. It starts with the chemicals, then it becomes the cells, then it becomes... Take us through that value chain.
So it starts with quartz, which is used to make polysilicon, which is the raw material that goes into solar panels. That polysilicon then is used to make wafers, which are these thin slices of polysilicon. From the wafers, you then make cells, which is that you do a lot of coating on the cells, put in some little wiring and stuff like that. So really purify the wafer substantially. It's a very complicated process. And then from the cells, you stack a lot of cells together into making a module. So when you see a typical solar module or solar panel, you'll see that it has, maybe 50 to 60 cells, little cells that are stacked next to each other. So that's the value chain.
And what can we do in India right now and what can we not do?
So what we can do in India right now is we can make the modules. So if
that's the final step.
That's the final step. It's not that capital intensive. It's not that tech intensive, but we are able to do that.
In fact, we have overcapacity. We can start exporting that.
Yeah, that's right. Then we can make the cells now as well in India. And I think in the next 2 to 3 years, we'll start making wafers and ingots. And then the final step is making the polysilicon. And that, I think, as soon as we get the policy signal from the government that they want to now start making polysilicon in India as well, that's when the industry is going to start getting into overdrive. Because you can't do it if you allow imports from China, fundamentally. So you have to stop imports from China, give that date in the future, that this is when we're going to stop imports, and that's when industry is going to start setting up capacity.
You're saying you have to say, I'm not going to allow imports from China because it's tough to compete with China, so industry needs that signal of protection.
That's right, exactly. I mean, look, China has almost 2x the world's demand requirement in terms of manufacturing capacity. The Indian market is a tiny market for them. For them to just dump capacity here is very easy. It's not going to hurt them, but it is going to make sure that a competitor country does not develop. And that's what they've successfully done in other parts of the world up till now. And so therefore, you have to protect industry. Otherwise, that capacity is never going to come up because China will always be cheaper, having a cheaper product, to import than if you were to make it in India. So I think we have to, pay that extra cost in the beginning to make sure that we have a fully domestic supply chain. And, once that happens, then over time, costs will start to converge as Indian industry becomes more efficient and better and we start learning more. And then maybe at some point, we can also become an exporter as well.
So you said modules India already has, cells, which is number 2, India can more or less, start to do and will soon become self-sufficient. You, for example, have got into the third one, which is ingots and wafers. You're about to set up a plant.
Yeah. We are about to set up break ground on setting up a plant, and that will take another 2 years to get active.
And is it time to do that? What made you comfortable that it is you have the ability to get into that? Is it because they said you can't import more?
Basically the government said that from June of 2028, they'll stop wafer imports, provided that there was sufficient capacity available in India. And so therefore industry is now responding to that and beginning to set up capacity so that come June 2028, we can stop wafer imports from China as well.
By 2028 end, you're saying India should be self-sufficient in 3 of those, which is modules, cells, and ingots and wafers.
That's right.
By 2028, India will be self-sufficient in all of those.
That's right.
What would be your timeline for the 4th one then?
It depends on when the government gives that signal. If they give us that signal today and tell us that from 2029 or 2030, polysilicon imports will be stopped, then obviously we'll all start thinking about setting up a polysilicon plant as well.
It is possible for India to become self-sufficient there also.
It absolutely is. There's no reason that we can't do it. We are moving in that direction. And I think it's actually healthy for the world as well, because we can't have the world's entire climate change effort dependent only on one country. It's better for there to be a different country making or having some kind of a manufacturing base. So at least, there is some diversification in supply chains.
For the world, it's great news. If the 2 biggest economies in terms of growth, in terms of contribution to growth, both follow a cleaner path from here onwards, it's the only way you'll prevent climate change. It's the only way you'll save the planet.
No, no,
So it has
100%.
to be India and
Yeah,
China
yeah.
doing
I
this.
think if you just look at it in carbon emission terms, today the European Union accounts for about 8% of global carbon emissions. India also accounts for 8%. Now, if India, as we double our, let's say, our economic growth output, if we just go from 8% to 16%, and the European Union does whatever they're doing and goes to 3 or 4%, it's not going to help us still. So it's very, very critical that India follows an entirely different path. And that's really what we were talking about in that Ember report, that you can see the initial signs of that happening because of all the policy push, all the action that is being taken by companies like us and so on in the sector. So there's really good, I think, public-private partnership within our sector.
So we've spoken at great length about solar. I just want to look at other things. Like solar is obviously attractive in India because the sun shines and shines a lot out here. What about the other things? I mean, I know there's a lot of push towards the new Shanti Act, and can nuclear also be set up, and wind, which is something that you're doing. There's some reports I've seen which says that the potential capacity for wind in India is even more than the capacity for solar, which is interesting.
Yeah. So wind, has the advantage that all the wind turbines are made in India. So the full supply chain is already in India. Wind is a little bit more expensive than solar is, but it's a good complement to solar. Adding wind capacity from an execution standpoint is a lot harder though, because every single wind turbine is a separate location, and going and acquiring land and then getting access to that land, that's a bit of a nightmare to execute. So that's why wind is moving, but it's moving at a slower pace than solar. The other opportunities we have are hydro. Building new hydro is not that straightforward. It takes many years. There are lots of surprises. Most of the projects go over cost, and they're vulnerable to things like earthquakes and so on. And we've seen that happening. The other thing is nuclear. Now, as you said, the Shanti Act allows now private companies to get into nuclear. We're still waiting for a lot of the rules and regulations to get firmed up. But it'll take time. It'll take at least 5 to 7 years for us to be able to add more, or to add any nuclear, because the supply chain hasn't developed, the technology hasn't got diffused. So all of that is something that needs to happen. But I would say 5 to 7 years from now, you'll start seeing a lot more nuclear getting added as well into the system.
All right, let me now come to the final sort of get you to lay out what your expectations are. Look ahead at 2030, look at 2035. At what point do you think we're going to be able to look and say, India's energy security is fine. We are okay. We are relatively self-sufficient. We've got lots of cheap renewable energy that is flowing. We're not worried about Iran wars or Russian sanctions or anything else there. We are good. What would your gut feeling be?
I would say that by 2035, let's say 10 years from now, we'll have a pretty clear sense of our energy future. And that energy future, I think, will be a lot more domestic and within our own borders. Would we have fully escaped from importing fossil fuels? Of course, that is not going to happen. And it probably won't happen for another 20, 30 years at the very least after
And you don't need to bring it down to zero. There's no harm in importing a certain amount.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. So I think that by that time, several things would have happened. Number one, renewables would be, by that time, the only new capacity addition that is going to be happening in the grid, because it'll be so much cheaper than anything else.
That's a strong thing you're saying, that in 10 years from now, the only capacity additions in India will be renewables.
So Vikram, in the last 5 years, of the total capacity added in India in the power sector, 80 to 85% was renewables. So therefore, saying that by 2035 it'll all be renewables is not a big stretch actually. So we've already moved quite substantially in that direction.
85% of all capacity addition in India now is renewable.
Yeah, that's right. We're adding, so last year, for example, we added about 50 gigawatts of renewables and about 8 or 9 gigawatts of thermal capacity, and very little of anything else. So we're already there. By the way, it also made us...
Coal generation actually fell last year for the first time ever, I think, the amount of...
Yeah, and I think that we'll reach peak coal by 2035. That's when you'll start seeing coal consumption begin to decline. We need to work on the transition, of course, for people, communities, and so on. So that's an important thing that needs to work out. So renewables will be, the entire electricity system will then be renewables. It'll be penetrating further and further into electricity. We'll have a lot of use cases developed for the non-electricity part of the energy value chain through green hydrogen and green fuels. We'll have nuclear coming out as well. You'll have already the first few installed nuclear plants getting set up. And the future of nuclear will also be a lot clearer by that time. We'll potentially have thorium as a fuel, which is also found in abundance in India rather than being dependent on external uranium imports. So I think by that time, that future of beyond 2035 to 2050 will be very clear. India is still going to be growing fantastically. We're growing at 6% a year in terms of our electricity consumption, 4% in energy terms. So all of that will continue to happen. But we would have shown a very, very different path of growth compared to anybody else. And we'll also hopefully by that time have a fully domestic manufacturing supply chain.
So last question then is, if you had to accelerate that timeline even further, the government's watching this, I'm sure they ask you all the time, how do we accelerate it? What do we do even further? What would be your top 3 or 4 policy prescriptions?
I would say number one is build out the grid much faster. That is the number one issue, because without that, you can't add all these renewables in the grid. You can't manage the grid as well. So that I would say is absolutely number one priority. The second thing I would say is work towards indigenizing the supply chain faster. It's already happening, but maybe we can do it at a relatively faster speed. So I would say that's number two. And then I would say on green fuels, we need to really push the use case side as well. We need to put pressure on our industries to move. I know that in some cases it's more expensive, but I think in the longer run, for our country, it'll pay off, because it'll mean that we'll have less dependence and eventually prices will come down. So the sooner we can start on that journey, the better it is.
All right. Well, Sumant Sinha, both you and I think, have spent our entire lives thinking about oil and fossil fuel as one of the major, major constraints that are holding India back. You're talking about a present and a future where that could change, and change very, very fast, because of the promise and the potential and the actuality of what's happening with solar and other forms of renewable energy. Let's hope all of this actually pans out. Thank you so much for joining us on the India Story.
Vikram.